Given day while we are enjoying life here in Canada, hundreds of Canadians around the world are being detained in foreign jails or held hostage, the victims of criminal or terrorist kidnappings. Behind the scenes and in the shadows, secretive members of Canada's security agencies work around the clock trying to secure their release. Andy Ellis was one of those people for 30 years. He worked on negotiating the release of Canadians in many high-profile cases, and he is the former Assistant Director for Operations with CSIS, now working with Eventel in Toronto. Andy, how would you rate the government's performance on this file at this point in terms of dealing with the Canadians who have been detained?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. I think if you talk about dealing with the Canadians that have been detained, I think they're doing the best they can given the circumstances. I think I would rate them less high in managing this, sort of over the longer term. This situation developed over a long period of time, and I think it could have been dealt with by having a policy in place some time ago. If you look at the way Huawei has been dealt with in other countries and the decision to allow them into the 5G network, for example, it was done sort of as a group, and had we made the decision at that time with the United States, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, and others, I don't think we would have stood out quite so much as we do now. And now with the arrest in Vancouver, we've gotten ourselves into a very difficult situation.
A lack of foresight before, so at this point, should the government be saying no to Huawei?
I do. I think, it would have been a lot easier to say no to Huawei some time ago. The difficult situation that we have here is, the best way I can describe it is people are being held hostage. People are being held hostage. Canadians are being held hostage in China, and it puts a different light on it. You now have to look at this as a hostage negotiation, a very difficult diplomatic negotiation, as opposed to a business decision that I think could have been made some time ago.
Andy, you've negotiated behind the scenes with China in particular on the Kevin Garrett case. He was detained in China. He was accused of spying, some similar circumstances. Based on that, what circumstances do you believe these Canadians are being held in now?
Well, it's a jail in China. It isn't the Metro West Detention Center. It's kind of tough. But by those standards, there'd be foreigners being held. They'd be dealt with a certain degree of kid gloves, I hope. That's normally the process, because it is a diplomatic issue. You want to keep them safe and healthy. Part of the job of the Canadian government is to make regular consular visits to make sure that they're okay. But, as long as you're held in a Chinese institution, it's extraordinarily difficult on the people being held, and probably equally or more difficult on their families.
We've heard them being questioned for up to 4 hours a day. And going back to when Kevin Garrett was held, he was kept in custody for about 2 years. Do you expect a similar timeline in this situation?
I don't know what the timeline is, but it's not good. The situation has been allowed to get to this point. I honestly believe it could have been avoided. As I said, had decisions been made on Huawei and 5G some time ago, I think we would have been able to sustain ourselves through the arrests in Vancouver a lot more effectively. Now it is into a very, very difficult situation, and diplomacy is slow, and the legal process is slow. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is the Chinese government have a lot of influence over people that are held in jails in China. In this case, they're clearly trumped up charges. That's not the case in Canada. By nature of our Constitution, the executive branch and the legislative branch do not influence the judicial system. Thank God. But it puts us into a difficult position. The Chinese are expecting us to intercede and intervene, and we can't. And as long as that continues, the same situation occurs in China. And they're playing exceptionally hardball.
Given the situation right now, would you go to China?
No. Absolutely not. And I think it's important that businesses, and that's part of what my company does now, is businesses take a very, very serious look at the people who are traveling on their behalf. Because, as I said, it's trumped up charges. They're grabbing people who have influence. They're grabbing people who, if you're working for Company X and it's very influential with the Canadian government and something happens to your employee, you're going to put a lot of pressure on the government to resolve the situation. So it's a tenuous situation, to say the least. I certainly wouldn't go for pleasure, and for business, until the situation is resolved, I would be very, very careful.
Do you think the travel advisory that the government has issued right now adequately expresses the risk for Canadians?
Yeah, I think it's carefully worded. My best measure, I'd say it's okay. We could talk for some time about the way information about travel advisories are conveyed to Canadians. It's kind of a 20th century conveyance, the way it's done now. You have to go out and get it, as opposed to it being pushed to Canadians. I think we can improve in the way that's done so more people can access it. It's okay, but exercise common sense. Understand what's going on right now and make your decisions accordingly. Make sure that if you're going and you have to go, you take precautions, and either that or don't go. Do it over the telephone, do it over Skype, or meet in a third country where it's safer.
The Chinese ambassador came out last week and said there would be repercussions if Canada did not allow Huawei in and ordered Canada to stop trying to recruit international allies. When you hear those threats, do you think there's a risk here to Canadian national security?
Yes, absolutely. I've never heard the Chinese make such bold-faced threats before. They tend to be exercise, a little more discretion in the way that they, convey this sort of information. This is, as I said, they're playing hardball, and I think it needs to be dealt with a lot of care. This is a tough situation now. Every part of the government needs to be involved. If I were the government, I would not stop recruiting allies. He wouldn't have said it if it wasn't having some impact. But again, had we made the decision on the 5G when everybody else did, we wouldn't be the lone person standing out. We would have survived this thing, and we would have been part of the wave that was done before. Whenever a decision is delayed, you're going to get yourself into situations like this, and I think the government could have done a lot better had the decision been made with some more alacrity than it was.
Andy Ellis, thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome.